Margaret Collins was a 35-year-old woman who worked as a nurse. Her day began with a 6 o'clock alarm and followed a regular routine. After finishing a 12-hour shift at a general hospital in Chicago, she would return late at night to her one-bedroom apartment. Though single and childless, patients called her Sister Margaret, and she was beloved for her gentle smile and attentive care. Her sister Jessica lived a life in stark contrast to Margaret's. 5 years ago, she had married David Hamilton, an executive at a medical equipment company, and they lived in a mansion in an upscale suburb of Chicago. The two-story White House was surrounded by expansive lawns, with a well-maintained garden and small pool in the backyard. Jessica lived an elegant life as a full-time homemaker, attending golf club parties and charity events on weekends. The sisters had been complete opposites since childhood. Margaret was introverted and loved reading, finding joy in caring for others. Jessica, on the other hand, was social and loved being the center of attention, possessing a natural talent for charming everyone around her. Their parents tended to be dazzled by Jessica's glamour, while Margaret's steady efforts were often overlooked. Jessica's marriage brought significant changes to the Hamilton household. David's mother, Eleanor, moved in with the newlywed couple. Eleanor was a refined and educated woman, but her relationship with her new daughter-in-law was delicate from the start. Margaret first met Eleanor on the wedding day, and her impression was of a gentle, intelligent woman. Eleanor was a former teacher who had taught English at local public schools for many years. After retirement, she participated in book clubs and community volunteer activities, leading a fulfilling life. In the early days of marriage, Jessica frequently complained to Margaret about her relationship with Eleanor. She seemed frustrated that her mother-in-law would comment on her cooking seasoning, offer opinions about cleaning methods, and constantly talk about the past. Margaret always listened to her sister's complaints and offered calm advice. Mom and Dad had a hard time at first too. Time will solve everything. However, Margaret felt an uncomfortable sense of unease every time she visited Jessica's house. Beneath the surface of what appeared to be a perfect family, there was an indescribable tension in the air. Jessica always acted cheerful, but sometimes her smile had an unnatural stiffness. David was busy with work and left almost everything related to the household to Jessica. Recently, Margaret had begun to notice changes in her sister. Jessica's conversations no longer centered on Eleanor as much as before. Instead, she talked constantly about frequent travel plans and their newly adopted golden retriever, Max. The requests she made of Margaret had also increased, walking the dog, collecting mail, helping with simple housework. Margaret tried to help her sister as much as possible between her busy work schedule. One evening, Margaret received a call from Jessica on her way home from the hospital. Her voice was bright as usual, but there was something hurried about it. "Hi, sis, thanks for all your hard work. I have a little favor to ask. David and I are going on a short trip this weekend. Could you take care of Max?" Margaret answered while dragging her tired body along. "Of course. I'll use the key to get in as usual, right?" Yes, thank you. Max really adores you." Jessica's voice was filled with gratitude. After hanging up, Margaret envied her sister's happy married life while being unable to ignore a small doubt deep in her heart. Recently, she had seen Eleanor much less frequently. Previously, she used to see her tending the garden or chatting with neighbors, but now she never saw her at all. Over the following months, Jessica's phone calls became increasingly frequent. There seemed to be travel plans every week, and each time she asked Margaret to take care of the dog. Wine trips to Napa Valley, beach resorts in Miami, ski trips to Colorado. Jessica said she was cherishing alone time with her husband David, but the frequency was abnormal. "Sis, this time we're going to Sedona. It's such a spiritual place, I'm sure our hearts will be purified." Jessica's voice was excited even over the phone. "Could you please take care of Max? He's become so friendly lately, and I think he considers you real family." Margaret felt conflicted as she held the receiver in the hospital break room. Max was indeed a beautiful golden retriever with a friendly personality. However, recently, every time Margaret visited her sister's house, she noticed that the dog's behavior was different from before. Previously, Max often lay in front of Eleanor's room, but now he was more often found near the entrance or in the living room. He had also begun to show restless behavior, as if he were on guard against something. "How is Max doing?" "I think he's lost some weight recently," Margaret asked with concern. "That's not true at all. I even had the vet examine him, and he said Max was very healthy. He's just more toned because he's getting more exercise." Jessica's answer was quick, as if it had been prepared. Margaret wasn't entirely convinced by her sister's explanation, but she didn't pursue it further. From her years of experience working as a nurse, she had developed the ability to sensitively detect subtle changes in people. However, when it came to family matters, she hesitated to trust that intuition. One Saturday afternoon, Margaret was spending time at her sister's house for the first time in a while. Jessica and David had gone on another trip, and after walking Max, Margaret was drinking coffee in the living room. The house was wrapped in silence, with only the occasional sound of the wall clock marking the passage of time. Margaret stood up and decided to peek into the study that Eleanor used to frequent. The door was closed, and there was no answer when she knocked. When she gently opened the door, the room was dim with the window curtains drawn. The bookshelf where Eleanor's favorite books had been lined up was now covered with a thin layer of dust. On the desk, newspapers from several months ago were still lying there. "I wonder if Eleanor is really okay," Margaret murmured quietly. Jessica had explained that her mother-in-law was unwell and recuperating in her bedroom, but despite this, Margaret had never heard about doctor visits or medications. Considering that Margaret herself was a nurse, it wouldn't have been strange for Jessica to consult with her. At that moment, Max appeared at the entrance to the study and began to growl in a low voice. The dog's eyes were fixed on the direction down the hallway, toward Eleanor's bedroom. Margaret was puzzled by the dog's strange behavior and followed Max's gaze. The end of the hallway was dim, and she couldn't see anything. "What's wrong, Max?" Margaret spoke to the dog while petting his head. Max pressed his nose against her hand, but his trembling was abnormal. A few days later, Margaret called Jessica on her way home from work. Her sister's bright voice flowed through the receiver. "Sis, what's up? It's unusual for you to call at night. How is Eleanor feeling?" "I was thinking I should visit her recently." Margaret chose her words carefully. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the phone. Then Jessica's voice became slightly stiff. "Mother-in-law has been told by the doctor to limit visitors. Her immune system is weak, so there's a risk of infection. Since you work at a hospital, sis, you especially need to be careful." The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but Margaret's doubts only deepened. From her experience as a nurse seeing numerous patients, she knew that patients in such conditions usually required more active medical support. "Which doctor is she seeing? If you need professional advice, I could introduce you to doctors at my hospital." "That won't be necessary. She has a private doctor." Jessica's reply was curt, and her intention to change the subject was obvious. "By the way, I have travel plans next weekend too. Could you please take care of Max again?" Margaret agreed, but continued thinking about her sister's attitude after hanging up. Previously, Jessica would have talked in detail about her mother-in-law's health condition and consulted with her sister. However, recently, she became somewhat distant whenever Margaret asked questions about Eleanor. The following week, when Margaret visited her sister's house again, she happened to meet Mrs. Parker, who lived in the neighborhood. She was a kind woman who used to chat frequently with Eleanor. "Margaret, it's been a while. How is Eleanor doing?" "I've been worried because I haven't seen her at all lately." Mrs. Parker's expression showed genuine concern. "I heard she's unwell and recuperating in her bedroom." Margaret relayed the explanation she had heard from her sister. "Really? But I've never seen an ambulance or noticed any doctors coming. I'm home most of the time, so I think I would notice things like that." Mrs. Parker's words deepened Margaret's anxiety. That night, Margaret sat alone in her apartment, lost in thought. Her sister's frequent trips, Eleanor's unnatural absence, Max's strange behavior, and the neighbor's testimony. These fragmentary pieces of information were beginning to form a single suspicion in her mind. However, it meant doubting her blood-related sister, and Margaret felt resistance to accepting her own thoughts. Tuesday afternoon, Margaret was preparing to go home after a night shift at the hospital, dragging her tired body. Her cell phone rang. It was a call from Jessica. Unlike usual, there was urgency mixed in her sister's voice. "Sis, I'm sorry this is so sudden, but I have a favor to ask." Jessica's voice sounded breathless. "An emergency came up at David's company, and we have to fly to Seattle immediately. We're leaving on the night flight, so could you feed Max?" Margaret looked at the clock. It was 3 in the afternoon. "Of course. Same as usual?" "Yes, thank you. That really helps. The food is on the kitchen counter." "Sorry, I'm in a hurry, so I have to go." The call ended abruptly. Margaret felt something was off. Usually, Jessica would talk in detail about travel plans and duration. But this time, she seemed to want to hang up quickly. Margaret was tired, but she was worried about Max remembering the dog's recent behavior. She thought it would be better to go as soon as possible. She had a light meal at home, took a shower, and then headed to her sister's house. Around 6 in the evening, Margaret arrived at the suburban residential area. Jessica's house was at the end of the street, with the setting sun beautifully illuminating the white exterior walls. However, both David's car and Jessica's car were parked in the driveway. Margaret tilted her head in confusion. If they were rushing to Seattle, at least one of the cars should have been used to get to the airport. The moment she opened the front door with her key, Margaret frowned. A strange smell was wafting through the house. It was different from the smell of decay, something sick and unpleasant. Even with her experience as a nurse in various hospital rooms, she had never encountered this smell before. "Max?" Margaret called the dog's name. Max, who usually would come running to the entrance, was nowhere to be seen. When she entered the living room, Max was curled up behind the sofa. The dog stood up when he saw her, but his movements lacked their usual energy. Margaret knelt down and approached Max. The dog was clearly thinner, and his coat had lost its luster. "Max, are you okay?" She petted the dog's head. Max pressed his nose against her hand, but his trembling was abnormal. Then the dog looked toward the end of the hallway and began to growl softly. Margaret stood up and decided to look for the source of the smell. When she checked the kitchen, dog food had indeed been prepared. However, the water bowl was empty, and old food was stuck to the food bowl. It looked as if proper care hadn't been provided for several days. The smell grew stronger toward the end of the hallway. Margaret cautiously proceeded deeper. As she approached Eleanor's bedroom, the smell became more intense. She covered her mouth with her hand and stood in front of the bedroom door. "Eleanor?" Margaret knocked on the door. There was no answer. When she turned the doorknob, it wasn't locked. When she peered into the room, it was in a more terrible state than she had expected. The windows were completely covered with thick curtains, and the room was dim. There was a bed, but no one was there. Used dishes and dirty clothes were scattered in a corner of the room. And at the back of the room, there was a small door that Margaret had never noticed before. Margaret felt her heartbeat quicken. The small door was installed in an inconspicuous location, like a hidden door. As she approached fearfully, she could see light leaking from under the door. And she faintly sensed a human presence. "Eleanor?" Margaret called out in a trembling voice. From behind the door, a weak voice could be heard. "Who, is someone there?" Margaret quickly opened the door. It was a narrow room that had been converted from a small closet. A mattress was laid on the floor, and Eleanor was lying on it. 68-year-old Eleanor was far removed from her previous refined and healthy appearance. Her cheeks were sunken, her hair was disheveled, and her clothes were dirty. In a corner of the room, a water bottle and a small amount of food were placed. "Eleanor?" Margaret knelt down and approached her aunt-in-law. A faint light appeared in Eleanor's eyes. "Margaret, is that you?" Eleanor's voice was hoarse. "Help me, please." In Margaret's mind, all the fragmentary information connected into one piece. Jessica's frequent trips, Eleanor's unnatural absence, Max's abnormal behavior, the neighbor's testimony about never seeing doctor visits. Everything had been a cover-up to hide this terrible truth. "It's okay, Eleanor. I'll call for help right away. Margaret took out her cell phone with shaking hands. As she dialed 911, her heart was filled with anger and sadness. Her own sister had driven this kind elderly woman to this state. 911, what is your emergency? I need rescue for an elderly woman. She appears to be confined. Margaret's voice was trembling, but she tried to maintain the composure of a nurse. The address is. After hanging up, Margaret held Eleanor's hand. The old woman's hand was cold and terribly thin. How long have you been here? Margaret was afraid to ask, but she needed to know the facts. Several months. I don't know exactly. At first, they said I was unwell and told me to rest in this room. But gradually, I wasn't allowed to go outside. Eleanor's voice was intermittent. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance. Margaret placed her hand on Eleanor's forehead. She seemed to have a fever. Dehydration was also severe, and she needed immediate medical treatment. It's okay, now. The ambulance is coming. You're safe. Margaret recalled her training as a nurse and quickly assessed Eleanor's condition. Her consciousness was clear, but she was obviously suffering from malnutrition and dehydration. The sound of the door opening could be heard at the entrance. The voices of paramedics echoed. Over here. Margaret called out loudly. Then Max appeared at the entrance to the hidden room. The dog's eyes showed relief that help had finally arrived. Margaret felt that her life would change dramatically from this moment. Trust in her sister, family bonds, and everything she had believed in had crumbled in this small hidden room. The ambulance siren broke the silence of the residential area. When the paramedics arrived, Margaret used her professional knowledge as a nurse to explain Eleanor's condition in detail. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, and physical and mental deterioration from long-term confinement. The paramedics' expressions were serious. The patient's consciousness level is clear, but she's in a state of severe dehydration and malnutrition. I believe she hasn't been given proper food and water for several months, Margaret reported calmly. Eleanor was placed on a stretcher and taken to the ambulance while receiving IN4. Margaret was allowed to accompany her, and during the ride to the hospital, she continued to hold Eleanor's hand. Tears of gratitude floated in the old woman's eyes. Thank you, Margaret. If it weren't for you. Eleanor's voice was weak, but her strength of will could be felt. Upon arrival at the hospital, Eleanor was taken to the intensive care unit. Margaret explained the situation to the doctor and provided detailed information about her condition when found. The doctor's diagnosis was serious. Kidney function decline due to dehydration, severely compromised immune system due to malnutrition, and psychological trauma from long-term confinement. Recovery would take a long time, but if discovery had been delayed any longer, her life would have been in danger. That night, a police investigator visited Margaret. Detective Dietrich was a middle-aged woman who specialized in domestic violence and elder abuse. Margaret, please tell us in detail about today's discovery, the detective said while taking notes. Margaret explained everything in detail, from the unease she had felt for months to today's discovery. Jessica's frequent trips, contradictory explanations about Eleanor, Max's abnormal behavior, and the neighbor's testimony. It became clear that everything had been a cover-up to hide the abuse. Where is your sister Jessica Hamilton currently? The detective asked. I heard she was on a business trip to Seattle, but their cars are at home. I don't actually know where they are, Margaret answered. The next morning, Jessica and David were arrested at the airport. They were actually headed to Las Vegas, not Seattle. Police investigation revealed the couple's motive. David's company was in financial trouble and had accumulated large debts. Eleanor's pension and the real estate and investment trusts in her name were their economic salvation. By confining Eleanor and cutting off her contact with the outside world, they were freely using her assets. They forged Eleanor's signature to embezzle her pension and withdrew funds from bank accounts in her name. Furthermore, they were preparing to sell Eleanor's real estate. This emergency business trip was actually a plan to flee the country with all their assets. During Jessica's interrogation, even more shocking facts emerged. The confinement had been carried out in stages. First, they restricted her outings for health management, then blocked visitors to prevent infection, and finally locked her in the hidden room. When Eleanor resisted, they forced her into submission by reducing food and water. At first, it was supposed to be short-term, Jessica stated during interrogation. When the money problems were solved, I planned to return things to normal. However, as the investigation progressed, it became clear that this plan was long-term and systematic. They had even prepared a plan to collect insurance money by faking Eleanor's death. If Margaret's discovery had been delayed by a few weeks, Eleanor's life would have been in serious danger. Margaret watched over Eleanor's recovery at the hospital while thinking deeply about her family. She couldn't believe that the sister she had known since childhood had been doing such cruel things. But facts were facts. Even she, who had seen the good and evil of many people as a nurse, found it difficult to detect the malice of her own family. Eleanor's recovery was progressing well. With proper medical treatment and nutrition, her strength gradually returned. However, the psychological wounds were deep, and counseling was necessary. Margaret visited the hospital every day and became Eleanor's conversation partner. The old woman began to talk little by little about the fear during her confinement. At first, I really was unwell. But gradually, I began to think something was wrong. I wasn't allowed to go outside, and I couldn't use the phone anymore, Eleanor spoke with a trembling voice. Jessica told the neighbors that I had developed dementia. That's why no one suspected anything. Margaret's chest felt like it was about to burst with anger and sadness. However, she had to be strong for Eleanor's sake. Eleanor, let's think about the future together. You're not alone, Margaret held the old woman's hand. A few weeks later, Jessica and David's trial began. They were charged with multiple felonies including elder abuse, confinement, fraud, and forged document creation. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was little room for the defense to argue. Margaret took the witness stand in court and testified in detail about the circumstances of the discovery. Jessica couldn't make eye contact with Margaret in court. The bright, social sister she once knew was no longer there. There was only a woman who was beginning to understand the gravity of her actions. On the day of sentencing, Jessica received a 12-year prison sentence, and David received 15 years. The judge stated that it was a planned and malicious crime that seriously violated the victim's human rights. The couple was also ordered to return all assets stolen from Eleanor as compensation to the victim. When Margaret left the courtroom, she looked back at Jessica one last time. Her sister was handcuffed and hanging her head. Complex emotions swirled in Margaret's heart: anger, sadness, and a slight sympathy. However, above all, relief that Eleanor had been saved prevailed. That night, Margaret invited Eleanor to a dinner celebrating her discharge from the hospital. It was a quiet meal for just the two of them in her apartment. A healthy flush had returned to Eleanor's cheeks, and the will to live dwelt in her eyes. "Margaret, I want you to become my guardian," Eleanor said suddenly. "I want to complete the legal procedures too. There's no one I can trust except you." Margaret was surprised. However, at the same time, she felt a deep sense of responsibility. She thought it was her mission to protect this kind woman. "I would be happy to take on that responsibility, Eleanor." The two took each other's hands and quietly confirmed the beginning of a new family relationship. Even without blood ties, Margaret deeply realized that true family is bound together by hearts that care for each other. 1 year later in spring, Margaret was living in a small house in the suburbs with Eleanor. Eleanor's health had recovered steadily, and through physical therapy and counseling, she had regained her former vitality both physically and mentally. Margaret continued her work as a nurse while fulfilling her duties as Eleanor's legal guardian. "Margaret, the roses in the garden have started to bloom," Eleanor said while preparing breakfast, looking out the kitchen window. Her voice was filled with the joy of living. Margaret smiled and replied, "They're blooming especially beautifully this year. It's thanks to your careful tending." Their new life together was peaceful and fulfilling. Eleanor returned to community volunteer activities and resumed her book club. Margaret respected her independence while providing support when needed. The two were practicing the truth that real family relationships are not about control or dependence, but about respecting each other's freedom. Max was also living with them. After Jessica and David's arrest, no one was left to care for the dog, so Margaret took him in. The golden retriever recovered his health with proper care and now showed his energetic form running around the garden. Max's presence brought healing and peace to the two women. Several letters had arrived from Jessica in prison. At first, the content seemed to justify her actions, but over time, words of true repentance began to be written. Margaret had hesitated for a long time about whether to write back, but recently she finally sent a short letter. She couldn't forgive, but she hoped that her sister would truly reform. There were reports that David was spending his time in prison as a model prisoner. He too had come to understand the gravity of his actions and had sent many letters of apology to Eleanor. Eleanor initially couldn't read those letters, but with her counselor's advice, she finally decided to read them. She learned that forgiving and forgetting are different things. One Sunday afternoon, Margaret and Eleanor were enjoying tea with their neighbor Mrs. Parker. The kind woman in her 70s had continued to care about Eleanor after the incident. "Eleanor, you've really recovered so well," Mrs. Parker said with deep emotion. "It's so good that Margaret was there for you." Eleanor smiled and replied, "Margaret is my savior. But perhaps we saved each other." Margaret nodded deeply at those words. By saving Eleanor, she had also found new meaning in her own life. While she had found joy in caring for others as a nurse, she was experiencing for the first time the deep satisfaction of loving and being loved as family. At dusk, the two spent time in the garden with Max. Eleanor was reading, and Margaret was preparing for the next day's work. It was an ordinary, quiet time, but that was what was most precious to both of them. "Margaret," Eleanor looked up from her book and said, "we've truly become family in the real sense." Margaret stopped what she was doing and turned around. "Yes. I've learned that there are things more important than blood ties." The two looked at each other and smiled quietly. In the distance, church bells announced the evening hour. Max lay contentedly on the lawn, and peaceful time flowed by. A year had passed since the incident, and Margaret had learned many things about life. Family is something you choose, love is the accumulation of small daily actions, and true happiness lies in living for someone and being needed by someone. Her sense of mission as a nurse hadn't changed, but now she also felt the joy of protecting Eleanor, her precious family, and walking together as a woman. As night deepened, the two went into the house hand in hand. Max followed behind. Three lives continued to walk toward a new tomorrow, supporting each other, proving that true family is bound not by blood relations but by hearts that care for each other.